Then going to have David Firth come up, and then we will wrap up the conference. So welcome, Chris.
Thank you. All right, thank you all. And David and I were just joking about how apparently we like to end the day here with the happiness people, talking about the really positive aspects. So it's a good way to end the day, right? But yes, thanks again for staying through and sitting through this. But what I'm going to be talking about is a specific issue, something that's fairly relevant, I think, to most workplaces, in a specific area related to worker happiness and health. So to give you a little overview, the first thing I'm going to talk to you all about is occupational stress and it as a major threat to, I think, our current employees as well as their employers, so the organization itself. The second major point that I'm going to go over is occupational stress and, why should we all care about it? Why should your company care? And then we're going to move into talking about what leads to occupational stress. So give you guys a little background on, what we know from research in terms of how individuals become, how these job demands lead to individuals having these massive negative outcomes in terms of their well-being and health. And then I'm going to talk to you and end the presentation talking about the importance of recovery in alleviating some of these issues with occupational stress, as well as how we need to start looking towards newer, more innovative approaches to reducing work stress in the, within our organizations. And hopefully talk a little bit about some of the work I've done with companion animals in the workplace. So starting off, the first thing I want to highlight is that occupational stress is a major modern threat to our organizations. And in particular, we found over the past 30 years that there is a fairly strong link between experiencing high levels of stress in any environment and having negative outcomes in the individual. But more particularly in terms of occupational stress, we're seeing that when individuals experience high levels of this occupational stress, they were having negative outcomes both at the individual level as well as at the organizational level. And so to kind of emphasize the nature and the major threat that this plays in terms of not just here in the U.S. but worldwide for across every country, I pulled a little quote from the World Health Organization where they cited that occupational stress has really become a worldwide epidemic. So we're having individuals across many different countries and many different organizations that are suffering negative outcomes, some of which are debilitating from having these overly high amounts of occupational stress from their job, specifically their job demands. So that leads into, okay, so why should we care? I've identified that I'm not the only one. I'm not up here speaking crazy in terms of that this has been something that quite a few individuals have identified as a major issue and a major threat. But why should we all care? So let's go over in terms of some statistics from some larger surveys, many of which were in the U.S. In terms of the years 1996 to 2000, a large survey of 800,000 individuals across 300 separate organizations found that employee absences due to stress increased 300% across this time period. So we're seeing that individuals can't even make it into work due to the fact that they're experiencing such high levels of occupational stress. And again, that's going to cost the company in terms of time lost as well as the individuals. They're having such high levels of strain that they can't make it into the office. And the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health found in a report that 40% of U.S. workers reported having very or extremely stressful jobs. So quite a few individuals are identifying that their jobs, the way they perceive them, are incredibly stressful. They see these as, all the time. They're experiencing these high levels of stress. And lastly, and I think most importantly, when we look at the bottom line, in terms of occupational stress and its costs, it's been estimated that within the U.S., occupational stress and related issues can have cost the U.S. industries across the board $300 billion annually. So this isn't just something that's affecting individuals within organizations. It's affecting organizations as a whole, and we're paying out through, and basically organizations are paying out through the nose in terms of having to deal with these occupational health issues that are a result of these massive levels of work-related stress. So, looking more at what the research tells us about at the individual level, occupational stress can lead to both negative psychological and physical outcomes. So individuals, when they experience these high levels of work-related stress, can have these psychological outcomes such as increased levels of anxiety, depression, apathy. And in terms of the physical outcomes, individuals can experience things such as increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, and increased risk for cardiovascular disease, so among many, many others. And in terms of occupational stress, it also can lead to damaging individuals' personal lives, so those interpersonal relationships outside of work. What we found is that higher levels of occupational stress tend to relate to individuals having difficulty within their lives outside of work, especially a typical issue you can probably all think of that you've maybe heard about would be one of your colleagues, one of your coworkers perhaps, having more fights, more tiffs with their spouse due to these when they're feeling increased levels of stress in the workplace. Very, very common. And so that's what we see at the individual level, but again, as I've kind of alluded to earlier, this doesn't stop at the individual level because, as we know, employees really, the human capital within our organizations, they drive they drive the organization and result in either it doing well or doing poorly. And what we found from the research is that when organizations have individuals that are experiencing extremely high levels of occupational stress for continuous periods, can result in higher levels of absenteeism, higher levels of turnover, higher levels of healthcare costs for the organization, and lower levels of engagement in both job roles and job responsibilities, and most importantly, lower levels of on-the-job performance by these individuals, which all end up damaging the company's bottom line. So fairly important for the organizations as well as for the individual employees. These overall, we're seeing that this is a major issue that we need to be concerned with. And so what leads to occupational stress? So we've identified that there's both at the individual and organizational level, there are some pretty nasty negative outcomes. But where's the origin of this work-related stress and these negative outcomes? How does it happen? So first, at the most basic level, what we can conceptualize occupational stress as is really just the perceived psychological pressures that individuals experience as a result of their work. I think most of us can intuitively grasp onto this, and it makes sense because most of us can think of a time when we were overloaded, had high time pressures, and felt this pressure, this psychological pressure, and maybe it started affecting us physically. Typically within the research, how we conceptualize occupational stress and how it affects and creates these negative outcomes is through a stressor-strain relationship. So stressors really can be conceptualized as any sort of condition that requires an adaptive response. And these can be either objective, so something such as loud noises, hot temperatures, but more often than not, it's something that's perceived. So the appraisal by the individual plays a big role in whether or not we're seeing these things as, we're seeing conditions within our work, individuals, events, whether or not we're seeing these as major stressors or not even stressors at all. And in terms of strains, what strains really are just negative responses to these stressors. And these can manifest as either psychological, physiological, or behavioral. So an example of a psychological one would be, again, anxiety, depression, negative thoughts, negative emotions. At the physiological level, again, increased blood pressure, heart rates. Down the road, if this continues, increased risk of cardiovascular disease, and behavioral. And what we're seeing more and more is workplace aggression and workplace violence, and individuals responding erratically and aggressively. So that's kind of the general model, but this, the relationship between stressors and strains may seem somewhat simple. It's actually quite a bit more complex, and this is due to the fact that occupational stressor-strain relationship is moderated by almost everything we find in the workplace. All of these different aspects of the workplace, of the individual, tend to affect this relationship and how individuals perceive stressors, and then subsequently how these affect and create these negative outcomes or don't. And specifically in terms of aspects on the employee Our personality traits that we bring into the workplace play a large role in this. Some people are just more resistant. You may be familiar with type A, type B. Individuals who are type A are much more susceptible to stress, much more aroused easier due to smaller events, whereas somebody who's type B doesn't have these issues. They don't become as aroused. They're more resistant and hardy to stressful conditions. Aspects of the work itself, so things such as role, ambiguity, and time pressures. So the nature of the work itself can play a big role in whether or not a specific task or a specific event is considered stressful and considered a major stressor and can lead to a negative strain. And finally, aspects of the organization itself. So the interpersonal relationships, the social support networks that are in place, as well as the culture, the overall culture of the company. These all play a large role in affecting this stressor-strain relationship. So it can be quite complex, especially once you start trying to delve into a specific company and you realize there's many things going on behind the scenes. So looking now towards the importance of recovery, and this is something that's near and dear to my heart because I do research in this area and have talked to quite a few academics who also do research in this area. And it's it's a relatively new topic, the idea of recovery, but it's something that's been around forever. If you even think back to Frederick Taylor, one of the first major industrialists who came up with scientific management, he was also the father of work breaks because he realized people break down like machines if they don't rest. And I think that's a good analogy. Think of your car. You can't drive your car infinitely, right? You can't just keep driving without having to stop, put gas, do maintenance, correct? Well, people apparently are the same way. We can't go on indefinitely forever just meeting work demands. And so the importance of recovery comes kind of from this idea. And researchers have theorized that employees have limited cognitive, physical, and emotional resources. And you can think of these more as energies. So we have these limited amount of energies. And occupational demands deplete these resources. So as individuals, we all have a finite amount. And when we come in for our workday, we are going to deplete these naturally by going through and meeting demands. The more quickly we have to meet demands, so the higher the time pressure and the more other stressor aspects, we may deplete these resources faster and faster. It just depends on the nature of the work, the nature of the job, and the nature of the individual. However, all employees, after a certain point of depleting these resources, are going to start experiencing a need to recover these resources. Because in general, what research has found is that we try to, our bodies, and both at the psychological and physiological level, try to maintain homeostasis. And so when we dip below, out of this range where we consider more of our normative levels of well-being, we have a natural need to regain resources so we can move back into this kind of homeostatic state where we're maintaining our well-being. And so in terms of recovery, how we can define this is that essentially individuals, when they reduce their strains by removing the job stressors that are affecting them. So oftentimes this involves actually physically leaving the workplace, removing these stressors, and then engaging in resource-generating activities. That's typically how we go about replenishing these lost resources. And what this does is it allows employees to rebuild the resources they need to meet future work demands. So in terms of, thinking of maybe all of us thinking of, how we go about work, there's always that point where you realize you need to get away. You need to leave your computer, you need to walk away and replenish yourself so that you can come back and be fresh and actually take on these demands and be able to meet them satisfactorily. What leads to recovery, though? And I've identified that activities do. Unfortunately, the one thing is that we found in the research is most individuals view activities very, very differently in terms of whether or not they're resource generating and whether or not they promote this recovery. So I always think a good example of this is yard work. Some individuals find this incredibly relaxing and incredibly rejuvenating, whereas I myself couldn't think of a worse punishment and worse torture. So, and again, I think that highlights the individual nature of these things. So what we found through research, and actually what the stronger relationships tend to be, are not the activities themselves, but the experiences that we gain from these. And the three that we've identified as having the strongest relationships and being the most important to reducing these strain outcomes and to promoting well-being is psychological detachment. So getting away from the job both mentally and physically. And one of the big things that individuals tend to do, and maybe some of you can think of examples when you've done this, is you may physically leave the job, but you start ruminating on what you have to do the next day. You start ruminating on the actual job itself. And so we see that as a particularly important one. Additionally, mastery, relaxation are both very, very important. So, and mastery can be thought of simply as having some sort of accomplishment, achievement in the activities you do outside of the workplace. So, typical recovery periods include work breaks, evenings, weekends, and vacations. Evenings and weekends being two of, I think, the most important because most of us have those frequently and they provide long enough periods that we can actually engage in significant activities that can promote these recovery experiences. However, in the modern, and I think this is something that's it's an increasing prevalent issue, in the modern workplace, there are some factors that act as barriers to regaining recovery. And communications technology, I think, is one of the biggest because now we have smartphones. Now we have these PDAs that we can take anywhere and everywhere, and so we don't ever have to be without something where we can work in any location. And so individuals, theoretically could keep working wherever they are, whenever. So that's basically reduced our ability to escape physically and both mentally the workplace. Additionally, there's been trends, especially in the white-collar professions, of longer work hours and working during off hours to remain competitive and within the industry as well as within your own company. So all these trends can act as barriers to engaging in necessary recovery activities, gaining these recovery experiences during these time periods that we have, so such as evenings and weekends. And what happens when we don't engage in recovery activities and continue meeting these work demands nonstop? What we find is that individuals tend to have increased negative emotions, lower positive emotions, increased levels of burnout, specifically emotional exhaustion, so they feel completely drained, poor health, and what we also find is there tends to be increased voluntary turnover, so individuals actually feel they have to leave the organization, and most importantly, lower performance is one of the big ones. So the two implications that we can draw from this, from the field in terms of looking across all of the research are that recovery leads to happier, more productive, and more motivated employees. So individuals who engage in recovery periodically and then come back to work tend to actually be better workers. They tend to be more engaged, more likely to engage in organizational citizenship behaviors, so go above and beyond to actually help others in the organization when they don't have to. As well as organizations that foster a recovery positive culture may actually do better than organizations that foster a 24-hour work mentality because the workers, the human capital that they're working with, may be more engaged, may be more productive, and may be more likely to go above and beyond. So the last thing I want to talk to you about is innovative approaches to reducing stress and promoting well-being. And I think this is important because if we can reduce the amount of stressors in the workplace and the perceptions of individuals of these stressors, then we can reduce the strains and therefore reduce the need for individuals to get away from work so often. And I think this is quite important. And in terms of the fact that where we see these most is in, and or at least when I have scanned through and looked at companies, and especially what they're doing, we find that the top 100 companies to work for that are usually identified by Forbes tend to be doing a lot of these innovative approaches. And so I think that's quite important to look at in terms of some of the things that they're doing and start trying to think of other, and these don't have to be necessarily expensive for the organization. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're a little out there, and they're not always fit for every organization. However, the idea is that we're looking for new, innovative ways to reduce workers' perceived stress in the workplace. And so a couple of these, free meals, climbing walls, yoga, and pets in the workplace are some that companies are trying out right now, and they're looking at as a means to make work a friendlier place for individuals to reduce these strain outcomes. Specifically, pets in the workplace, my own research has identified that this may help foster an environment of trust between individuals, greater levels of collaboration, cohesion, and even lead towards greater levels of satisfaction with coworkers as well as with the job, with tasks and the job itself. And so I want to leave you with that, while there's scant research on these new innovative approaches, the one thing that we do in general that we think that these may lead to are more satisfied and productive employees, better quality applicants. So you may develop a reputation and end up having individuals seek you out for employment that have better skills, and better knowledge and better abilities to help your company move forward. You may be able to retain the critical talent that you have already. They choose not to leave because of the value that they feel based off of these innovative approaches that you're doing to reduce their stress. And lastly, it could foster a more creative and collaborative organizational culture and help you move towards being that innovative organization that's going to set market trends. And so that's all I have for you. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris.
Mm-hmm.